in Maryland, they've banned the M1A, but the SCAR 20S is legal, despite the fact, and there's no legal, there's no reason for it other than Democrats just decided we will start regulating these things because it sounds good on paper.
To be anti-regulation is, in my estimation, absurd. But that doesn't mean that you don't look at each regulation and make an assessment as to whether it's functioning or not. There's a lot of local regulations that I think are unhelpful at times. I'm sure on a federal level there are some regulations that are unhelpful. But the bottom line is, fundamentally, do you allow the government to have this ability to regulate? The idea that we have that it inhibits the free market in some way. I think the idea of a free market is absurd, doesn't exist. But beyond that, we're always regulating the market. It's just a question for whose benefit are we regulating it? That's the bottom line.
I think free markets can only exist temporarily until someone amasses power and then displaces the market and becomes the power structure.
There is no, what is a free market?
It would be like 10 people who live 10 miles from each other, they trade periodically. But once you get to a point where anyone controls one resource, you start to get power displacement, and then you'll end up with power centralizing.
Yes. Well, the first thing that you're talking about, hasn't existed in
forever.
Yeah, forever. I mean, really.
But it's like, I talk about this with left libertarianism because a lot of people on the right say it doesn't exist. And I'm like, it absolutely does. It's hippies living on a farm. You know what I mean? That's left libertarianism. They're just hippies on a farm. There's no need for great power structures or police because 10 people living on a farm get along just fine.
Yeah,
but scaling things up is where...
and maybe they're completely self-sufficient, but they got there in some fashion, and it wasn't they drove on roads that were built right by a society. So. It
is funny because I always hear libertarians say that it's a meme who's going to build the roads, and I never actually get a response.
Well,
like private companies,
you can find private companies that are going to build roads, but they're
they do.
Yes, but they're not going to build it to everywhere. Out here, we had
to build this road.
Well, you built the road, not the paved one.
The the one that goes onto the property we had to build.
Well, yes, of course. But the paved one gives you the opportunity to, that's the way you get to the airport.
Yeah. So I guess the point about regulation is I certainly agree. It's like Republicans across the board are almost always talking about deregulation. But
it's absurd.
But I don't see Democrats talking about cleaning regulation either. Right? There's a give and take. But let me give you a better example.
What does cleaning regulation mean?
Getting rid of the bad ones.
Oh, my God. I mean, I would say so to an excessive standpoint. I mean, this is, and I'm not speaking positively of this, but, that guy Cass Sunstein underneath under the Obama administration, it was absurd. The idea, look, I don't think you ever have to worry about the Democrats putting too much regulation on things because to a certain extent, there's still elements within that party, and hopefully it's getting drummed out.
Well, guns is a good issue on overregulation.
Neoliberalism. Guns are
overregulated in ways that don't quite make sense, right? So that's an example of, for instance, semantic definitions of high capacity and standard capacity, what those even mean. But more importantly, the specific example would be in Maryland, they've banned the M1A, but the SCAR 20S is legal, despite the fact, and there's no legal, there's no reason for it other than Democrats just decided we will start regulating these things because it sounds good on paper.
Well, I think that probably the reason is that we have a court that decided in 2008, after almost 200 years in this country of not perceiving an individual right to carry a gun, but only in the context of being a well-regulated militia, that because the court has lurched so far to the right over the past 2 decades, particularly most recently, that I think the idea is that you chip away at this from a legal perspective to try and build a legal precedent by doing, whatever. I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific regulation, but I would imagine that's the idea. We're going to get as much regulation as we can in this. I don't know, what's the damage done by that? Maybe from the perspective.
Made people felons who have an archaic, it's unfair to call it archaic, I guess, but like the M1 Garand is like a Vietnam weapon. And the M1A is a more modern version, but it's like a wood stock, and it's got like it's a 308. The Scar 20S is a modern AR-15 style variant, which is substantially more efficient.
Well, I am definitely in favor of outlawing, all of them, if that makes it easier.
Every single one.
Well, I listen. I think that people. I have no problem with people using weapons that are specifically for hunting. That's I'm okay with that. But
see how I segued into guns now?
Well, I'm happy to. It's absurd. I think.
It's a bit of a forced segue.
But the Supreme Court has lurched to the right, and
completely agree.
Two Supreme Court justices on the right who I think want to retire in Alito and in Clarence Thomas, and I would love Donald Trump not to have the opportunity to appoint their successors.
I don't want to go too. I want to stay on the guns for a bit, but the sign's pointing to a Trump victory. It doesn't mean he's going to win. I don't know if he's going to win.
Didn't you tell me we were driving up and somebody asked me if I'd been on your show before, and I said, yeah, I don't know what show it was because you got so many, but
it was actually this channel.
Okay,
that was like 7 years ago.
And nobody can find that interview, but I'm quite convinced that you also predicted a Trump victory then, and that must have been it was pre-COVID.
Well, this was like 2017, 2018.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, maybe not, but I'm pretty sure it was.
I mean, I am unclear as to who's going to win this election. Nobody knows. I see positive signs for Harris, but I can't tell if that's me being aspirational or not. So,
well, I would certainly say I learned my lesson with 2020, right? So I'm looking at, for instance, Moody's Analytics, and they always release this economic report where they're like, here's our projections, and they tout how it's historically accurate. And then what I think I saw was there was an increase in support for Trump. And what I thought I was calling out accurately was an increase in opposition to Trump, but the opposition certainly was greater. But I think the biggest function of 2020 was Republicans just don't know how to win elections. That's why I think the last Republican to win a popular vote was it Reagan, I think?
Oh, well, Bush in his second election did, but he did that by basically coming out and bashing gay people and driving out
war.
No, I think that was actually despite the fact, in the wake of 9/11, there was a lot of intimidation by the Republicans, and they attacked a lot of Democrats for being, Max Cleland, who lost both his arms and his legs or an arm and two of his legs, I think it was. He was running for re-election in Georgia, and they called him Osama bin Laden.
Wow.
But yeah, who knows? Hillary Clinton had a 95% chance of winning, and the 5% came in. So I don't. But let's go back to. I'm going to ask you about the Supreme Court, because it sounds like you have a problem with how their rightward shift. Is that right?
The first challenge is like right and left mean different things in different areas of governance and culture and things like this. So it's when we talk about right.
Well, I'm talking about in terms of the Supreme Court, in the context of what a Supreme Court does. I mean, they don't dictate culture so much as they dictate law.
No, what I mean is, like you say, rightward shift, and defining what right and left are in different contexts, I think, matters, because if we say,
in the context of the Supreme Court, rightward shift would be one which
traditionalist, I would say, versus progressive. That's what I'm trying to draw the distinction on, because like right economic they're certainly not right economic to a certain degree.
The Supreme Court is not right-wing in terms of economics?
So right economics to imply more like laissez-faire capitalism versus...
oh my God, they're completely attacking the government's ability to regulate. They're completely attacking the government and disempowering the government is basically saying, government is always...
That's not laissez-faire. Right?
It is almost definitionally laissez-faire, yes.
Well, no, allowing large corporations to have revolving door policies and protections for large corporations is not
revolving door policies. What is that? What do you mean?
Like when, the CEO of Halliburton gets a job in government or something like this, right?
Well,
when there's an exchange between the government.
Laissez-faire is where you basically
yeah, buyer beware.
I think it's a smokes. No, that's caveat emptor.
I know. That's why I'm insulting it.
Laissez-faire is where essentially And I think it's a little bit of a smokescreen. But laissez-faire specifically means the government completely backs off and does not intervene in
right.
what's going on.
And what I'm saying is I think many of these powerful elites that we would describe as right are in favor of protections for their buddies and their billionaires.
Well, the reality of neoliberalism as it coming out of Mont Pelerin and the society, it was ultimately about a protection racket for a specific industry or specific players within an industry.
But fair point. More right word than like relative to where we are. Yes, completely agree.
No, it's just it's almost definitionally right.
Right word shift. Yeah, I think I was pulling hairs.
Well,
but anyway, so I agree to a certain extent. I'm fairly modern on a lot of issues. I think there's got to be some push and pull. I think I'd like to see a Democratic Party that provides sound regulation in key areas that matter, like we're talking about lead and water and things like this. And then I'd like to see actually any party, I don't care who does it, like it's a sound reason to be like, hey, don't dump lead and garbage in our water. But at the same time, it's also to say, hey, we should reassess what we blocked and why we blocked it. Then maybe there's some regulations.
What specifically are you talking about?
Like certain things to be deregulated.
Like what?
So the M1A, for instance, right? So I brought it to guns. My point is just in general.
What's the what?
It's a specific example of where Democrats have regulated firearms in a way that makes literally no sense.
Okay, it makes no sense.
Do anything.
What's the downside here?
Making people felons for owning something while allowing.
How many of those people have been made felons by owning a
10,000? I don't know more.
10,000 felons. There are 10,000 felons in. When was this in Maryland?
You mean convicted?
No, you said felon. I'm just asking.
Right. So I'll give you an example. The pistol brace ruling, right? So when the courts ruled that pistol braces made a pistol a short-barreled rifle, I actually had to dismantle a bunch of my weapons and separate. And there was no law passed. There was no act of Congress. This was ATF making an arbitrary decision that I was now committing felonies for simply having owned a legal product that I bought that was legal at the time. And Congress never passed this law. So now I risk prison over a nonsensical regulation.
You were talking about Democrats and
overregulating
things. But you just said that this was not a law that was passed. It was an assessment made by the courts.
No, it wasn't by the courts. It was the ATF, arbitrarily.
And
this is the Chevron ruling, that the agencies have a right to self-regulate and make their determinations. So the ATF, this is partly why people on the right were celebrating this, because the ATF was arbitrarily deciding that it was now a crime without any act of Congress. So we had to actually, I had to go dismantle.
So aside from these instances with you don't like some of these gun regulations, what other regulations do you have a problem with?
I don't know. I mean, there are certain things that I want to be regulated more than I think about in terms of deregulation. The lead in the water pipes is the easiest example.
Lead is actually.
And why isn't it being enforced is the question, I suppose. But
well,
also,
it is being enforced. I mean, the problem at what happened
about uranium too.
What happened in Michigan was that you had a Republican governor who wanted to basically disempower a city that was, frankly, a largely African American city, and
I think gambling should be regulated. I am no fan of the deregulation. I think what we
but I'm specifically, I get that you have some issue with some like very marginal gun
should
stuff.
Be regulated.
But what should not be regulated? Like you said that you have a problem with what Democrats are doing in terms of regulation. I'm curious as to
I think that's an overestimation. I think that I would like to see regulations reassessed and then either.
But which ones? What are you talking about?
I'm saying we should have a review of regulation in general.
So you think we should review every single regulation that exists?
I think they should have sunset clauses.
Why?
Well, because nothing's infinite, nothing's absolute. We might say, for instance, okay, I'll give you an example of regulation.
Lead's always going to be bad for people.
Yes.
So that one we wouldn't sunset, right?
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah. But we're talking about if we apply a regulation to a specific body or something, a body of water, perhaps the body of water may change. So, I'll give you an example. Like we have
toxins in the water are always going to be toxic.
Which is why like I said, I'm in favor of more regulation. and that the deregulation thing is just a safeguard on we shouldn't be making sure that we're reassessing periodically.
Why would you sunset like those like regulations on what is poisonous in water, for instance?
I wouldn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you just said that.
That's why I said I think it's an overestimation of. I think you may overestimate what I'm trying to say.
Oh.
Is that
Oh.
typically I think like phthalates, for instance, should be regulated. I don't believe there's a quote unquote free market solution to keeping endocrine disruptors in our food. That makes no sense.
No, I agree with that. I don't think that's controversial. But
there are regulations on things like your vehicles, your engine standards, guns, for instance. And I'm not saying I know specifically each and every regulation that should be deregulated. I think it is prudent for a society to say, hey, there's no market solution to stop people putting poison in our food. Our food has become just trash. But there is still a circumstance where we do understand that not every government application is going to be permanent or will work permanently. And I can put it a different way. There may come a point where the regulation isn't strong enough. And if we don't reassess what the law is...
Oh, I have no problem with strengthening regulations. I just, when you say deregulate or we should have regulations sunset or anything like that, I mean...
It just depends on what
you understand that, like, what we're talking about here is there is a battle between people who would profit privately and socialize the costs. In other words, put it on all of us. So you want to sell, well, let's just go back to Flint. You want to sell you want privatize this water supply. You want to give contracts to, because this is what the Republican governor there wanted to do. And the costs associated in this instance, like, they wanted to save money by not necessarily treating the water or, by delivering it in a way that will save them money. But the costs are socialized insofar as you've poisoned thousands of these children.
I went to Flint and I actually ran tests on the water, and it's crazy the macroeconomic issues at hand in Michigan, and what ends up with like a Republican politician is that. For a lot of the people that live in the area, they're not directly impacted by what's happening to these kids, right? For people who live outside the area, they're going to see the news and they're going to say, like, how could this be possible? And so what ends up happening is actually it was a dude from Occupy who was working up in Detroit who was talking about the water crisis. And the problem started with population collapse. So he explained to me like this: you have a fixed water system in the Detroit and the surrounding cities. Let's say, hypothetical numbers, 100 people live in an area. It's $10 per person per month to run that fixed water system. So let's say 10 people and it's $100 a month. Let's make it simple. If 5 of those people leave, the fixed water costs remain the same. And now it's $20 per person.
Oh yeah, no, I get that.
So what ended up happening?
Who's paying for that?
The city, the people who live there are paying the taxes to maintain it. They're paying their water bills.
But what ends up happening because we have a private enterprise that is getting in between the deliverance of that water and the people, that their profit margins go down. I mean, if you go and you look at like activists there will also tell you this was like a big privatization scheme. I mean, this is the biggest problem that we're dealing with, in my estimation, around this country is the movements to privatize, the idea that corporations can do something better than the government. Look, all major enterprises have waste.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.